Thank you. Good evening. Just a caveat. This is my first time giving a talk like this, so please be nice. And also, if you have any feedback, I'd love to hear it. So the idea of this talk came to me while I was sort of working with some colleagues at work, that, particularly some people who were newer to development, and they were trying to follow some code through one of our applications. So I'm a software developer. I work at Maiden in Bath, and in my free time in the evenings, I like to volunteer as a software developer for a couple of charities and non-profits. You can ask me more about that, not now. So MVC, I didn't use ChatGPT to come up with this title, so I tried to make it catchy, but it's probably not as good. One, it doesn't say on the tin, and this is the thing. So these are the things that when we say MVC, we go, people know this, and they might not. So who here recognises MVC? I'm assuming most of you. Yeah, I'm gonna go through the basics just so we're all on the same page, but we won't spend very long on this. I also can't change slides. There we go. So obviously we have the model, and the model is the representation of the data layer, and it holds the business logic. So typically a model will represent one table in our database. Not always, but most of the time. Then obviously we've got the view, and the view is responsible for composing user interfaces and displaying the data. And we all know that, and that makes sense. And then finally, we have the controller. And the controllers are, as we know, the brains of the application, and they accept the user input, and they interact with the model and the views, and they pass all the user input to the model, and they get the information from the model and give it to the view, and then they make the view the pretty stuff, and they hand it back to the user. And that's MVC, right? Everyone's got that? And so that's great until you have someone come in and you go, right, here's our application, it's MVC. You can do MVC, you know MVC, we put it on the Java application. Can you just go and find this piece, like, here's the application, here's how it works. Can you go and find this piece of code? And someone looks at it and goes, and I've seen people look at it and go, where's the controller? Because there's the first thing that isn't on the tin is the router. And you go, but it's just the router. The router is really easy. It is when you know how your routes work. Do you have one routes file? Do you have a routes file per module? Do you use PHP 8 attributes and attribute all of your controller classes? Or do you do something completely different? You know that because you've been working on this. Someone new comes in and goes, how do I I've got the URL, I've got the controller, how do I join them up? And so the first thing we have to do is go, this is how we do our routing. And as soon as you've got this, you've got the map. And it makes it really easy. And someone flies in and they can find the controller and they can find their way through. But when we say MVC, we just go, you know MVC, and we forget this bit. So yeah, that was, I guess that's the first thing, the first missing piece that we don't talk about. And then I want to talk about just another thing, and that's the model. We put a lot of pressure on a model because we say, this is where the business logic goes. And in every example you see of a model, when you look at the MVC architecture pattern, it'll be like a really simple example, which is great. And that's where all of our applications start, but it's not where they stay. So let's think about, we're going to use a hypothetical banking app, and I've done it because there are some weird edge cases that I can use. And yes, I know I'm picking an awkward case, but just stick with me. So in our banking app, the example might be, okay, well, we want to just get the account information. That's great. So we're going to need an account controller and an account model. And we know that we'll come into the controller, and the controller will want to get the account information. So, okay, we'll add a get account information on the model. And this is really easy. The model is just interfacing with the database. We're querying the database. We're getting our record for the given ID. And then we're returning that structured account information. And you can structure that how you want. That's not for now. But what if we want to add some more business logic? And we can do that. So maybe we want to add an overdrawn attribute to say, like, is the balance less than 0? And if so, then the account is overdrawn. And we won't necessarily put this in the database, but this is some business logic that will exist on the model, so that every time you go and access the account information, it will calculate this for you, or it can be calculated on the model and passed back with in your data structure. And that's fine. That still makes sense, right? This is all about the account. It all sits here. It all makes sense. And then we might go, oh, but we should probably, when we get the account, we should probably get the recent transactions as well. And that's fine, okay. We know that accounts linked have a one-to-many maybe with transactions, and we can see those transactions for an account. So we can just query that relationship, we can get that information, and we can return that again in the structured account information. And you can see how already this simple example that we always start with has got a little bit more complicated, but you would say all of this feels pretty comfortable in the account model. It's all pretty simple. We're not overreaching too much. I don't want to say single responsibility too many times because I'm going to get some stares about good code and bad code, but it's all in there. So what about though, we've got our account, we want to arrange a transaction. Okay, so we want to create a transaction between two accounts. So immediately my head goes, we're making a transaction, so that goes on the transaction model? Okay, maybe. You may disagree. But to create a transaction, we need a transaction controller, we'll make a transaction model. So we create a transaction. And then we're going, all right, we need to accept the account that's paying, the payee account, so the account that's receiving the funds, and maybe the transaction value. Then we want to check everything is valid. Okay, so now on the transaction, we're checking two accounts. We're checking an account has enough money, maybe. And then we're creating the transaction and moving the money. And now this makes me feel a bit uncomfortable because I'm going, oh, there's a lot of account stuff here, but I guess it's related, I suppose. It's a relationship. But we've got a lot of business logic about the account over here. And is that right? Is someone going to come and be like, single responsibility principle? And they might do. So it already gets a little bit confusing. But then what happens if we want to add some extra code? Like, what about if there is a daily transaction limit? Or if you want to send a notification if the transaction fails or succeeds? Oh, that's fine. I'll just add some more words. And by words, I mean code. And we'll check the paying account has not exceeded its daily limit. We'll notify the payee if the transaction succeeds. We'll notify the paying account holder whatever happens. Now the transaction is doing quite a lot. And you might go, okay, well, we can fix this because we could just move it over. We could just move this over into the account model because there's more account stuff going on here than transaction stuff. And then you go, yeah, but then we're still moving business logic that maybe sits with the transaction. And then you go, well, what about we split it out? And this often happens, we split it out and we go, so where does the logic that knows we have to do this one and then this one go? And then we go, oh, it goes in the controller. And then I say, well, what happens if we want to do a schedule payment that isn't initiated by a HTTP request? You can't call that controller from your job. And so then we get into conversations about other design patterns. Do we look at services? Do we look at actions? And now we're not going to go down that rabbit hole because that is a rabbit hole for another talk. But suddenly you can see how I started talking about models, but now we're off somewhere completely different. And these are all decisions that you or your company make when you're building an application. And it's very easy when someone comes in to say, oh, we use MVC. And can you do MVC? Great, you can do MVC. Here's our code base, you carry on. But what are the bits around the outside? And this is, the sort of thing here is, I just wanted the one thing you take away is just being a bit more mindful when you're communicating that to people who maybe haven't seen your code base before, or they're just a bit new, being like, saying MVC, because it's a word that it's an acronym that we all use all the time, can sometimes hide quite a lot. I think I've said it's MVC, it does what it says on the tin, but there's stuff that's not on the tin. And just remember that when you go away. Obviously there's a lot more here around conversations about like, well, how do we make those decisions? Where do we draw the lines? What other paradigms do we use? What other design patterns do we use? Do we always use the same ones? That's not for this talk, but just think there's MVC, but there's a little bit more. So, I mean, I actually rattled through that really fast. So, thank you for listening.